So welcome everyone. As Troy said, my name is Derek Johnson. I'm a reporter here at Federal Computer Week where I cover cybersecurity policy. And we really have a great panel lined up for you today. We're drawing folks from the private sector, from the federal government, to talk about cyber analytics, data crunching technology, insider threats, and more. I just heard in the previous session someone from the private sector saying, everyone's asking these days, what's your data strategy? And that is very much the case when it comes to the federal government as well. There is really just an ocean of data out there that's collected not just by the government, but the private sector, open source data. There's plenty of it, and you're seeing the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and other departments and agencies really sort of positioning themselves in their strategic plans, as well as through bodies like the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, to really sort of transform the federal government's technology infrastructure and their workforce from one that operates in a world of data scarcity to one that is in a world of data abundance. So each of our panelists brings a really unique perspective and background to this issue. With us today, we have Dr. Erica Borghard, who served as the Senior Director and lead of Task Force 1 for the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. That's the task force that focused a lot on military issues. She's also an assistant professor at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. We also have Julie Ard, who is a principal insider threat researcher at Noblis. And then last but certainly not least, we have Captain Hal Cole, who is commanding officer of the Navy Cyber Defense Operations Command. So welcome, everyone. I won't sort of spend any more time on an intro. I want to kind of jump right in. And I think a place that I would like to start is to talk about the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. It's something that I've covered a lot, but we can kind of start with Erica. Erica, if you could just sort of start by just taking maybe 30 seconds to explain kind of just what the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is, just for those who might not know. And then, Pillar 6 of the report really kind of deals with preserving the military's information advantage, gaining better situational awareness, sort of staying ahead of the enemy, getting better reporting metrics for DoD, and just really kind of speaking to the need in the military for more data and better leveraging of that data in their operations. So can you kind of talk about how the commission approached this particular question, and what sort of role you all envisioned for data and analytics in this kind of new future state of cyberspace operations?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here with everyone today. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to discuss, the range of recommendations that are in the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report, which covers, a wide set of issues. So 30 seconds on the commission itself. The commission was established in the 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. The purpose of the commission was to develop a comprehensive strategy as well as a set of policy recommendations to defend the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequences. The namesake of the commission draws its inspiration from President Eisenhower's Project Solarium, which in the early days of the Cold War was meant to was a sort of competitive strategic process to develop a grand strategy for the U.S. With respect to the Soviet Union. And the idea was that we are living in the contemporary environment in a similarly sort of exigent and systemic strategic challenge, with obviously very different and unique characteristics and implications. But that was kind of why we were named the Solarium Commission. There are 14 commissioners, 4 from the executive branch, 4 members of Congress, as well as 6 senior leaders from the private sector, and then a significant staff organized into different task forces. As you mentioned, I am the lead for Task Force 1, which focused on the military perspective. Task Force 2 was focused on sort of domestic defense and resilience, homeland security, and Task Force 3 was focused on international partnerships, norms, and engagement. And the report reflects the sort of collective work of the different 3 task forces. So hopefully that was 30 seconds on the commission. But in terms of your question about how the commission sort of thought about data and analytics and the role of the DoD, before I get into the specifics of the DoD, I think it's important to sort of give a little bit of background on how the commission thought about data and analytics more broadly. And so I think that there was a general understanding across the commission that one of the key gaps facing the United States is that we don't have a complete picture of the threat environment in cyberspace. And that's because part of the picture resides within different critical infrastructure sectors and in the private sector, such as data that may be aggregated by various ISACs, data that resides in private cybersecurity firms. Part of the picture lies within the DoD, which tends to be focused on what we know about adversaries hitting the DoD's own networks. And then, another part of that picture, a significant part of it exists within the intelligence community and their perspective of various threat actors, which may be shaped by the particularities and nuances of different collection methods. And I could go on. And so the sort of key challenge with respect to data that the commission focused on was, how can we develop a more complete picture of the threat environment, given the reality that each stakeholder is only seeing one piece of the puzzle? And I would say that another sort of key challenge that informed our thinking was that threat actors don't just target, for instance, aviation or financial services or the DoD. Rather, they're targeting across sectors in both the public and private spheres to achieve strategic ends. And so, as a matter of first principles, the commission wanted to focus on how we can better understand the strategic motivations of these different threat actors, how they are operating sort of dynamic, evolving organizations, and that this information should drive our own defensive efforts as well as our offensive efforts, because ideally we would want to be able to anticipate and prepare rather than always react and respond to adversary activity. So it was a very long-winded context setting, but to get to the sort of DoD-specific focus, certainly, data and analytics played a key role in how the commission thought about improving military capabilities for both offensive and defensive missions. And so I just would like to point out a number of sort of key recommendations within that pillar that address different aspects of that challenge. One I would highlight is the Commission's recommendation to institutionalize DoD's participation in public-private cybersecurity initiatives. The thinking behind that was to build on the recent Pathfinder initiatives with the financial services sector as well as the energy sector to institutionalize them and better resource those efforts. And so, by way of brief background, the Pathfinder initiatives basically involved sharing of threat data, joint training, and some exercises. And the Commission was hoping that an expansion of these efforts might include things such as co-located analysis, the development of sector-specific concepts of operations, and things like that that would drive a more sort of complete understanding of the threat environment. I'd also point to the Commission's recommendations about expanding hunt-forward efforts to conduct threat hunting on allied and partner networks with the permission of host nations to uncover adversary malware, better understand TTPs, improve early warning, and improve how we share that information with relevant stakeholders. So that's another key recommendation that kind of gets at this broader picture. And then the final one I'd like to point out is the DIB Threat Intelligence Sharing Program, which is particularly relevant here. And that recommendation was meant to address not only making participation in a threat intelligence sharing program mandatory and sort of streamlining that effort, but also calling for greater investment in technology and capabilities for automated detection and analysis. So I know there's a lot there, but that's what informed the Commission's thinking about how we think about this challenge from a strategic perspective.
Yeah, and we'll dive into some of those recommendations more granularly as we kind of go on here. But I wanted to talk about one of the sort of recommendations that really sort of talks about finding new ways for the Department of Defense to measure some of the new strategies that have been put in place recently, like Defend Forward, like persistent engagement, and certainly interested in hearing Erica's perspective on that. But I also, I wonder if Hal or Julie, if anyone sort of just has some viewpoints in terms of, those are big strategies, overarching strategies, very hard to measure what success means and what success looks like. Any insights into kind of what kind of conversations are being had over on the DoD side about this and some complications that you deal with when you're looking to measure success in this area? And I'll kind of throw that out to Erica or Hal or anyone who wants to sort of jump in and take it.
I'm happy to frame it from the commission's perspective and then, have follow-on conversation. But I guess from our perspective, this was a really important recommendation because obviously you can't know if your strategy is working unless you can define and measure outcomes across different levels of analysis. And for the commission, it was important because the report does emphatically come out in support of Defend Forward. This means that DoD is going to be more operationally engaged. But from the commission's perspective, that had to come along with measures of effectiveness. And, I would like to note there have been some positive efforts recently on the congressional side that require reporting on qualitative and quantitative metrics in the FY20 NDAA. But those metrics were focused on readiness metrics for the cyber mission force. What we wanted to push from the commission perspective was sort of strengthening that those requirements and making them focus not only on measures of readiness, but also on outcomes and thinking about outcomes across tactical, operational, and strategic levels. And so the report does kind of go through a number of different ways to think about how to measure outcomes, whether it's measuring the impact of Defend Forward operations on adversary behavior and capabilities, as well as on DoD's ability to carry out key missions and things like that. But I would also like to emphasize, and I don't think this came through quite as clearly in the report, but it did kind of inform our thinking and kind of informed how a number of the recommendations about sort of a clear picture of the threat environment come together is that we need a baseline level. We need to be able to measure some baseline level of activity of threat actors to be able to know the extent to which your own operational activity is causing them to deviate in one direction or another from the baseline. And so, having a sort of complete picture of how adversaries are operating across all these different sectors is something that can inform the development of that baseline. So then we actually can know how to ascertain meaning behind deviations from it. But you have to have that baseline first. And so that was something that we were kind of focused on in our work. But I'm curious to know what others think with respect to those questions.
I'll jump in and talk to a little bit of that. And so, again, Captain Hal Cole, the commanding officer of the Navy Cyber Defense Operations Command. And so I've got responsibilities both as the cybersecurity service provider, which DoD requires for every network. So I've got all the Navy's networks, for better or for worse. And then also as the Defensive Cyber Task Force Commander for the U.S. Fleet Cyber Command. So really, as I listen to what Erica's saying, and I really just kept nodding up and down because I do agree with everything you're saying. I look at this really in two spheres, really three spheres, but I look at from the threat intelligence perspective, I'm looking at red cyberspace and trying to understand, like Erica just said, what is the adversary doing? What does normal look like? And then where are they deviating from that? Secondly, I'm looking at our own network operations. I'm looking at blue cyberspace and trying to understand, and this is a lot of what the national and the service cyber protection teams did early in their lifespan, just understanding our own cyberspace, our own networks. What does normal look like? Because day in and day out, we still don't always understand that as well as we should. DoD is not a corporation. Anybody that thinks that has not peeked under the covers there. Massively complex in the number of organizations under that one larger umbrella. And so everybody's got networks, big, small, doing different things, business, operational, et cetera. And so how do we know that? How do we map that? And then how do we sustain that picture? And then now how do I bring those two pictures together so that ideally I'm understanding what is happening out in the adversary's, frame of reference, and what is the impact to me? What are my vulnerabilities versus what are those threats? And then how do I then determine risk? So that's kind of how we look at things. I tend to say, as the defender, I do not operate the Navy's networks. Therefore, I don't secure them either. I defend them. A little bit different mindset. But if I'm operating out in gray cyberspace in neutral, the rest of the internet, I am hopefully seeing and learning what's happening in other parts of the world on other networks prior to that activity getting to my own cyberspace that I'm required to defend. I do work closely with the network operators to make sure that the vulnerability surface area is minimized as much as possible.
Great. And we will come back to this topic of the Solarium and the recommendations, but I do want to bring our other panelist, Julie, into the discussion. And so, Julie, you work on insider threats and sort of look at some of the analytics that are involved in that. I am really curious. This is something that we cover and study over here at Federal Computer Week. And one of the questions that I always have is really just trying to get a sense for what the effective metrics are in this space when it comes to tracking insider threats, understanding that there's no silver bullet, that sort of each one of these indicators is not by itself meant necessarily to indicate that someone might be a compromised individual. Can you kind of talk about what the data and what the science maybe says about when you're tracking insider threats, sort of what you're looking for, what has been successful, and have those definitions sort of changed over the last 5-10 years as we've gotten more into this world of data?
Sure. Many provocative questions in there. Metrics is a big topic in the insider threat community right now. There's actually an upcoming paper on measures of effectiveness coming out of the INSA, that's the Intelligence and National Security Alliance Insider Threat Subcommittee. And a couple of points on metrics. You can use many of the same metrics that measure your cybersecurity effectiveness in measuring insider threat effectiveness. But of course, you don't want to explicitly rely on that one stakeholder, cybersecurity, because it's important to realize that this is a pervasive problem. It's a historic problem, and it has not been solved by any one of those stakeholders alone, just by evidence that it's a continuing problem. So if we're looking 5-10 years ago, there are other organizations or other departments within an organization that have traditionally kind of held responsibility for this problem. If we're, thinking about, force protection, human resources, cybersecurity, of course, counterintelligence, other organizations such as that have had primary responsibility. But it's very important to make sure that you're not focused, too much on one. One of the metrics I want to talk about is you can actually use the results of your security assessments to measure your insider threat program. As one example, since insiders take advantage of authorized access, it might be helpful to look at what those authorized accesses are. It's very easy for managers to assign broad access because that enables people to do their jobs. But that also increases, the scope of the authorized access that an insider would have. So you could measure the number of privileged users as a percentage of the overall population of the organization. And, tracking number, that's just one example of many, but tracking a number like that over time and comparing, the number of incidents, the frequency of incidents, and then, of course, you'd want to track back to what the root cause of those incidents was, and then, kind of look at how did we get here? If this person abused their authorized access, then we need to take a look at how we assign that access. It's just one example.
Gotcha. Sort of philosophically, I think one of the things that I sort of grapple with, both with this topic and with concepts like zero trust, is how do you strike that balance in terms of making sure that you have a really rigorous tracking program in place to look at the things that you need to look at that maybe indicate someone might be compromised? How do you do that and still sort of create an environment of collaboration, of trust among your workforce and your employees? Does that present problems? Do you typically find that sort of folks are able to segregate in their minds sort of what they get tracked on for insider threats versus maybe just some of the more general workplace surveillance concerns? Can those bleed over if a program isn't careful? Talk to me about sort of how you deal with that balance of equities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for more or less, people accept that they're being, monitored on employer resources, as should be the expectation. But one thing that industry is discovering is that obviously no one wants to be thought of as a threat. That's a bit demoralizing. That can affect your morale and possibly also just create disgruntlement. So it's an approach that's having a lot of success in industry is reframing the insider threat program as a workplace safety program. And there's actually also some work going on to look at the positive benefits of insider threat programs. One example of which is, instead of just finding a problem and, let's just escort that person to the door and cut them loose, that's that kind of creates, that stressful environment. If you have a buddy that is having some trouble in their life, hitting many of the indicators, you want to help that person, right? So if the program is actually helping people, providing financial counseling, EAP, helping address whatever the root of that problem is that occurs left, of boom, that improves the morale, improves participation, improves reporting, reporting being a very important data source for insider threat programs. So that's one thing is pitching it as a positive and backing that up, of course, with actions and resources to be able to make it a positive workplace safety program. Additionally, organizations need to, it's very important to improve and focus on increasing and maintaining the credibility of the program. Many programs historically have kind of, relied on security through obscurity. Nobody knows we're doing this, and then every now and then, you'll take action against someone and rumors, will persist. And that's kind of, what's relied on for the insider threat program's security is obscurity. But instead, if you make it very clear, you're following a data strategy, as we heard earlier, comprehensive Watch the Watcher program, and also implementation of need to know and technical privacy controls. These things can all raise the credibility of the program, and those things help with the issues that you raised about zero trust.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. It sounds like the more that you sort of can make your insider threat program operate not just as a surveillance kind of mechanism, but also maybe leverage it as kind of an early intervention tool. If you're seeing some of the worrisome indicators, someone like having financial debt or some sort of crisis in their life, that you're sort of coming to them not just to say, hey, the system is saying that you are at risk for maybe being an insider threat, but also saying kind of how are you dealing with this problem? Is there, are there any resources that we can offer? It sounds like kind of the more that you can build that into your program, the more successful it can be.
And it enables the organization to, recoup the investment they've made in that person, and reduce turnover. So that also helps with the overall morale and productivity of the organization.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, whether Erica or Hal, sort of just from your own perspectives, kind of how you look at the way that sort of either DoD, the Navy, or just the government in general sort of looks at these insider threat programs. what sort of equities you consider and what kind of impact they have, positive or negative, that kind of we need to keep an eye on as these programs become more and more prevalent throughout government.
I'll say as a career signals intelligence officer in the Navy, who also, part of my portfolio there is to be in the cyber sphere. But I grew up in this world from the time I was a very junior officer, getting a security clearance, all the background checks accompanying that, serving, working at the National Security Agency, multiple tours. So that's kind of been the norm for me to understand that insider threat program is there. And I've never really been too concerned about it. But I also, concern I do have is, even as thorough as those processes are, they're still not perfect, as we all know from some very public breaches in weeding out those insider threats. And so I think about how does that correlate to the business sector, to the DIB and places like that, where if government can't be perfect or close to perfect with all the resources we expend, how does the business sector do that? So that's one concern. One thought I've got on that is we tend to focus insider threat on the person, but I would offer we don't always, and we still don't do this anywhere that I've seen, we don't understand the value of the data that we are trying to secure, and concerned that a person, an insider threat, might take advantage of. And so as a result, we default to trying to defend largely, I say this at macro, all data at the same level for the same amount of time. And so when we know that not all data is of the same value for that same period of time, so how do we get more discreet in defining value on our data, therefore then assigning and being able to protect or focus the insider threat efforts against those areas where it would be most likely not only for someone to potentially try to go after, but also would cause us the most damage. That's one way I think we could try to start getting after how do you measure that.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
That actually brings up a great point. The unique data sources that the government has, often they reside on legacy systems. The processes, that they're used to support are very, very unique within the government and within many organizations. So it's very important to have that subject matter expertise. Number one. Number two, it's also very important to have some kind of baseline processes, right? So that you can see what normal is, so that you can detect what abnormal is, and define analytics very, very specifically to detect the misuse of that data.
Great. So I want to, we have a sort of a question coming in that relates to this topic from the audience. So best time to pose it, I think, is right here. So we have a question. How do you best handle the privacy and policy related issues that come with collecting information for monitoring insider threats, sort of similar thematically maybe to what we're talking about here in terms of turning an insider threat program into a surveillance mechanism, sort of for civilian and private industry in the European Union and other places. This can be a significant issue for insider threat detection. So how do you sort of approach the privacy and policy side of this?
This is why it's so important to have all of the stakeholders at the table. You don't want to get too far down a road and then find out that there's not policy to support what the program is doing. It's also very important to ensure that each of the analytics are supported by policy and perform that sort of analysis.
Gotcha. Anyone else want to weigh in, or?
I think it just gets interesting, especially in government. Again, largely we are on government furnished equipment within government perimeters, although we're seeing right now where that's rapidly breaking down. So the privacy aspect, we all are kind of conditioned to understand we have no privacy on those government systems. Where that gets interesting is as you start thinking about BYOD, bringing your own devices and the mixing of personal and work data. Now there are ways and methods to do that, but and to keep those separated even logically on a personal device. But at least my viewpoint has been that it's still not always well implemented. And so how do you implement something that is well thought out? The policies are there, are clear, so that the user understands this is mine, this is yours, and then sustain that. It's one thing to put it in place. It's another thing to sustain it, to maintain it, and keep it that way over time.
So let's move off of this topic briefly, and there's something that I wanted to ask Hal in terms of the Navy Cyber Defense Operations Command recently started using a automated centralized security event management system, as I understand it, just to really ingest all of the overwhelming amounts of data that you all were getting from sensor generated alerts across your network. I would just kind of love to hear from you about what you were dealing with sort of before that, what kind of caused you to gravitate towards a solution like that, and sort of what is the difference in terms of your ability to ingest and process that kind of data today versus before.
Yeah, no, certainly, and appreciate the question. And so prior to me taking command last summer, so it's been actually a couple of years, NCDOC is about a 10-year-old organization. Prior to that, it evolved from others like so many do in DoD. But we were suffering from an information deluge, a data deluge, and really from paralysis of analysis. And 200 plus network perimeter sensors globally, plus other host-based feeds, intelligence feeds, threat feeds, really was just overwhelming the analysts. And we have a good sized team. The Navy has invested, quite a good number of people to attack this problem. But as I walked in the door, and luckily my predecessors set me up for success here, they acknowledged, and even down to some of the most junior personnel, these were young sailors that actually recognized and then took action to implement a SIEM here that, in our case, it's Splunk, but we use others as well. But we were able to take a lot of those data sets, and as we understood what normal was on our networks off of our sensors, we automated the repetitive. And so the previous panel talked a lot about this. I smiled as I listened to some of those speakers, because I hear them, saying they have the same problems that we have. In some ways, maybe we've taken a step ahead. In other ways, we're still trying to catch up with others. But the large volumes of data, the more that you can automate the known, you can turn around and use your human capital, use their brains for the unknown, for those unique problems that human minds are uniquely attributed to work. And so that's even more important now, as I've continued to try to gather, back to my red-blue scenarios there, I'm trying to gather more data in both directions. From the blue, from my own networks, we recently, over the last 6 months, have turned on a endpoint EDR across the Navy's primary enterprise network. And so I went from not great host-based data to I have 350,000 plus sensors now on every host, and I'm collecting that data. There's no way I could do that manually and analyze that manually. I have to depend on technology to do what it does best, which is aggregate data, make some sense of it based on certain rules and behavioral heuristics, and present that to my analysts, who can then take further action. And so in that sense, on the network side, that's been valuable. On the threat intelligence side of it, again, continuing to absorb and aggregate more threat intel feeds. I'm somewhat uniquely positioned. As I mentioned before, my background's in signals intelligence. And so NCDOC, we have some unique authorities even within DoD, whereby we have access to the National Security Agency, to the National Threat Signals Intelligence System. And we use that data for defensive purposes. We have all the right, checks in the block there to be able to do that in a safe, secure, lawful manner. But that data is invaluable to us to be able to understand threat, what's going on, around the world. But I don't live on that alone. I have to have commercial threat intelligence feeds, because I need to see what's happening out in the rest of cyberspace globally. And so I have to aggregate all that. And again, the only way I can do that is to automate much of that, as we're even looking, down the road of machine learning technologies. Some of those are applied in some specific tool instances, And even we're exploring working somewhat with the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center within DoD, the JAIC, to understand how do we apply AI to these problems and let computers help us even more there. So,
yeah, it's fascinating.
Jumping off on that point real quickly, leveraging computers to help analysts and defenders as much as possible. Thinking about all of that data that you have, there are approaches being researched. Noblis actually has a patent application in on something that would operate similar to data loss prevention or intrusion prevention systems for insider threat. So just imagine all of that data informing insider threat defenses for the known problems that make up the largest volume of your threats.
Thank you. So I want to go back to the Solarium real quick, but certainly interested not just in hearing what Erica might have to say, but also anyone else who wants to sort of jump in. There's a number of recommendations in the report that really talk about strengthening the analytic capabilities of agencies and hubs like the FBI, like the Cyber Threat Intelligence Integration Center, really to get better around this question of attributing cyber attacks often that happen and come from nation state actors who are hiding and obfuscating their tracks. It continues to be a huge issue. It seems like the government's gotten a little bit better at it, but I'd love to hear from the panelists, whether it's Erica or others, and we can start with Erica, about just kind of how they approach this question. Like, where's the government doing well in this area? Where do they need to get better?
Yeah, so sure. It's a great question, and it kind of spans a number of different aspects of the commission report. I think attribution as sort of a policy question was central for the commission in terms of how we thought about what the requirements would be for sort of implementing our strategy. So we have the strategic approach of layered cyber deterrence, and many of our commissioners were focused on how we can map different policy responses in support of deterrence objectives at different thresholds and levels of confidence with respect to attribution. So that kind of was a central question for the commission that we debated. One of the key things that the commissioners debated was whether there was a need for an independent attribution center, sort of to create a new entity within the federal government that was charged with integrating and synthesizing and analyzing and making determinations about attribution. And so we ended up not pursuing that approach. And so instead, what you see in the commission report is a number of recommendations aimed at strengthening existing organizations within the federal government that play a key role in attribution. So whether that's the FBI or CTIC or other entities, that was kind of where we landed from a policy perspective. And so I know we're running short on time, but just for CTIC in particular, the recommendation to strengthen CTIC came out of the fact that CTIC was created as part of ODNI in 2015, but it was never fully resourced in terms of personnel, capabilities, funding, all of the things that it would need to carry out its mission of being the primary integrator for cyber threat intelligence. And so the purpose behind that recommendation was for Congress to codify CTIC through legislation so that it could be institutionalized and provided with the resources it needs to fulfill the goals that were set out in 2015. And so that reflects the commission's thinking about attribution and how to strengthen the existing elements across the interagency that play a role in that.
We're very close to wrapping up here, but if anyone has sort of just for a minute or so, if anyone else kind of wanted to weigh on this question, sort of now is your time.
Yeah, a big technical challenge for attribution for both internal and external threats, but primarily internal, is entity resolution. There's a large body of research on resolving entities so that you can correctly attribute behavior to individuals.
Gotcha.
I would only add on that as well, that collaboration across DoD, across government is still, we've done a lot, but we still have a long ways to go to be able to have the frameworks necessary for us to share that information. To the point Erica made there of how do we do that, and what does that language really look like, so that we're all speaking from the same playbook.
All right. Well, plenty of questions and discussions left around this area. We are unfortunately out of time, but I do want to thank all of my panelists, Erica, Julie, Hal. Thank you so much for lending us your perspective, kind of as we talk about these issues. And for the viewers, I really hope that this was a useful and valuable discussion for you. But that concludes our panel discussion. Thank you so much.